Imagine this. You've just finished mowing your lawn. The grass is trimmed, the edges neat, the kids are playing on the porch. Life feels calm, ordinary. Then, an envelope slides into your mailbox. At first glance, it looks harmless. Just another letter from the Homeowners Association. But inside is a fine, $200. The reason? A tiny patch of weeds, barely visible unless you crouch down. You laugh it off. Surely this is a mistake. You'll take care of it. No big deal. But that's where everything changes, because the fine doesn't go away. It grows. $200 becomes $400, then $800. The letters keep coming, cold, demanding. By the end of the month, it's not hundreds and it's thousands. And soon, the impossible number appears, $10,000, and with it, a threat no family wants to hear. Pay or lose your home. This isn't a horror story. This isn't fiction. This is what happened to the Parker family, a quiet, ordinary family who thought they were safe in their suburban neighborhood. But behind those white fences and manicured hedges lurked something darker, an HOA board obsessed with control. At the center of it all was the chairwoman. Clipboard in hand, rules memorized line by line. Neighbors called her Karen. She didn't protect property values. She hunted for rule breakers. And when she locked onto the Parkers, they became her favorite target. And here's where things start to spiral. Because Karen didn't just find them. She showed up at their door. She walked their lawn. She made sure everyone in the neighborhood knew the Parkers were trouble. But what Karen didn't know was that the Parkers were recording everything. The fight that followed would rip through the neighborhood. It would turn friends into enemies. It would push the Parkers to the brink of losing everything they worked for. But then came the moment that flipped the entire story upside down. A single social media post, one video clip. That was all it took to expose years of hidden abuse. And once it was out there was no going back, because suddenly, the whole town was watching. The news picked it up. Strangers weighed in. And Karen, once untouchable, was cornered. In this story, you'll see how a $10,000 lawn fine spiraled into a battle of intimidation, secret meetings, hidden footage, and finally, justice. And trust me, the twist that comes at the end will leave you stunned. This isn't just about grass, it's about power, it's about abuse, and it's about one family's refusal to be broken. So don't go anywhere. Because the Parker family's fight against their HOA isn't just a story, it's a warning. And when you hear what happened in court, you won't believe how it ends. The morning was quiet when the letter arrived. The envelope, plain and white, bore the seal of the Homeowners Association. For most neighbors, an HOA notice meant little more than a reminder to trim the bushes or repaint the mailbox. But for the Parker family, this was the beginning of something far darker. Inside, the letter was brief. A violation had been recorded. Unkempt lawn, presence of weeds, immediate action required. At first, it seemed almost laughable. The Parkers prided themselves on their home. The grass was freshly cut, the flower beds were tended, and the only imperfection was a small cluster of weeds near the corner of the driveway. Hardly a crime, but the notice didn't stop at the violation. Attached was a fine, $100 due within 10 days. And in bold print at the bottom, a warning. Failure to comply may result in additional penalties and legal action. For a moment, the family brushed it off. Everyone made jokes about HOA Karen, the president of the board who seemed to live for nitpicking every yard and every porch decoration. Maybe this was just another one of her stunts. Surely it would go away. It didn't. 2 weeks later, another letter came. The violation had been reassessed. The Parkers were now in non-compliance. The fine had doubled to $200, and a daily late fee was being added. By the end of the month, the amount owed had ballooned to nearly $800. What had started as a single patch of weeds was suddenly a growing financial burden. The neighbors began to notice. Some whispered that the Parkers had let their lawn go. Others shook their heads, remembering their own run-ins with the HOA. The board's reputation was already strained, but this was different. This was relentless. The Parkers tried to reach out, to explain, to argue. But every call went unanswered, every email ignored. When they attended the next HOA meeting, the president sat stone-faced, repeating the same line, "The rules are the rules." What the family didn't know yet was that this was only the beginning. The fines weren't stopping, they were escalating. And behind closed doors, the board was already discussing the ultimate penalty, putting a lien on the Parker home. 3. Notice on the door had been just the first shot in a battle that would soon consume the entire neighborhood. And as the fines grew, so did the Parkers' determination to fight back. The Parkers had thought that once they explained themselves, reason would prevail. They had imagined a simple phone call, maybe a conversation with the HOA board, and everything would be cleared up. After all, it was just a few weeds in a corner of their lawn. Who could possibly believe such a small issue could destroy a family's peace of mind? But reason never came. Instead, 2 weeks after the first violation letter, another envelope appeared in their mailbox. The paper inside was harsher this time. It was no longer a polite notice, it was a warning. The fine had grown, swelling from $100 to nearly $2,000 in less than a month. Buried in the HOA's legal language were phrases that chilled the Parkers: continuing violation, administrative costs, failure to remedy. It didn't matter that the weeds were gone. It didn't matter that Mr. Parker had reseeded the patch, edged the driveway, and even mowed twice in a week to prove his compliance. The HOA was unmoved. Every envelope carried a new accusation. The mulch was the wrong color. The grass was above regulation height. Even the garden hose coiled neatly by the garage was suddenly considered aesthetic clutter. At first, the Parkers laughed bitterly at how absurd it was. But when the laughter faded, only dread remained. Each fine piled higher than the last, a snowball rolling downhill, gaining momentum they couldn't stop. By now, neighbors had noticed. Some whispered in sympathy, others in fear. A few admitted quietly that the board had done the same thing to others before, bleeding families dry until they either caved or sold their homes. It was a tactic, a weapon, and the Parkers were the latest target. The final straw came one evening, at dinner. Another letter, another violation, another fine. But this one carried a sentence that froze the room in silence. Failure to remit payment may result in a lien on the property. A lien. The word hit harder than any dollar amount. It meant the HOA had the power to seize their home, to force them out, to take the place they had poured their savings, sweat, and love into, all because of a few pieces of paper signed by people who lived down the street. That night, the family sat at the kitchen table long after the food had gone cold. Stacks of letters lay between them, each one like a ticking time bomb. Mrs. Parker's hands trembled as she flipped through them. Their eldest child asked in a quiet voice if they were going to lose the house. Mr. Parker didn't know how to answer, but in that silence, a decision was made. Instead of throwing away the letters in frustration, Mr. Parker began saving them, carefully. He organized them by date, by accusation, by fine. He began photographing the yard every week, every corner, every flower bed, every strip of grass. He even purchased a small hidden camera, the kind meant for security, and mounted it discreetly near the driveway. If the HOA wanted war, then so be it. But the Parkers would not fight blind. It didn't take long for the camera to pay off. One morning, as Mr. Parker reviewed the footage, his jaw dropped. There she was, the HOA president herself. The woman neighbors whispered about. The woman they jokingly called Karen because of her reputation for pettiness and control. The footage showed her walking across the Parker lawn at night. She bent down by the flower bed, pulled at a patch of soil, and deliberately scattered dirt across the driveway. Then she raised her phone, snapped a picture, and walked away as calmly as if nothing had happened. The next day, another violation arrived. The photo attached to the letter matched the moment caught on camera. The same dirt she herself had scattered. It wasn't neglect. It wasn't weeds. It was sabotage. Mr. Parker's first instinct was rage. His second was to march to her house and confront her. But his third instinct, the one that stuck, was patience. One clip wasn't enough. She would claim it was an accident or that he had tampered with the footage. If he wanted to beat the board at their own game, he needed more. So he waited, and the HOA president, perhaps too confident in her power, made it easy. Every week she returned. Sometimes she pulled at the flower bed. Sometimes she tipped over a small decoration. Once, she even uncoiled the garden hose and left it stretched across the yard, only to cite it later as a violation of safety standards. Each time, the Parkers captured it. Each time, another letter came. Each time, the fines grew. $3,000, $5,000, nearly $10,000. From the outside, it looked like the HOA was tightening its grip. But in truth, the Parkers were gathering a weapon. Piece by piece, clip by clip, they were building a story. A story not of weeds or grass or mulch, but of power abused, rules twisted, and a community betrayed. And soon the entire neighborhood, maybe even the world beyond it, was going to hear that story. Because the Parkers weren't just fighting for their lawn anymore. They were fighting for every family who had ever been bullied into silence. And they were about to show the HOA what real accountability looked like. By the end of the third month, the Parkers' mailbox had become a symbol of dread. Each day they braced themselves for another letter, another fine, another threat wrapped in an official-looking envelope. The stack on their kitchen counter grew taller than a phone book, the paper weight of it pressing down on them like a storm cloud that refused to pass. But what the board didn't know, what the HOA president herself couldn't have guessed, was that every single letter was part of a trap the Parkers had been setting in plain sight. The hidden camera, tucked neatly into the corner of the front yard, never missed a night. The first clip of sabotage had been shocking, the second infuriating. By the fifth, the pattern was undeniable. The HOA president was not documenting violations. She was manufacturing them. Sometimes she came alone, clipboard tucked under her arm, phone light illuminating the grass as she crouched like a thief. Other times, she brought another board member, both whispering in low voices as they kicked at patches of mulch or sprinkled seeds where they didn't belong. Always the same routine: create the mess, snap a photo, and vanish. The Parkers collected everything. They labeled each file, matched each clip to the violation letter that followed, and saved every shred of evidence in multiple backups. It was tedious, exhausting work, but with every clip their resolve hardened. Meanwhile, the fines ballooned. The official balance now stood at just over $10,000. The board had begun sending certified letters, stamped with legal threats, warning of liens and court action. On paper, the HOA looked untouchable, but behind the scenes, the cracks were widening. Word of the Parker situation spread quietly through the neighborhood. At first, it was whispers. A neighbor mentioning the late-night visits, another admitting they'd seen the HOA president snooping near their yard as well. Then came the stories. Families who'd been fined into silence, couples who'd sold their homes at a loss rather than keep fighting, widows who'd been cited for grass. They couldn't mow fast enough. The Parkers weren't alone. They were just the latest in a long line of victims, and that was when Mr. Parker made a decision that would change everything. He created a private folder online. He uploaded the clearest clips of sabotage, the letters that matched them, and the running total of fines. Then late one night, he drafted a post. It wasn't angry. It wasn't dramatic. It was simple. He laid out the facts, attached the footage, and asked a single question. What would you do if this was your family? He hesitated before hitting publish. His finger hovered, the weight of the risk pressing down. If the board found out, retaliation would be swift. If neighbors sided with the HOA, the Parkers would be pariahs. But the silence was already killing them, and the evidence spoke louder than any fear. He clicked. Post published. At first, nothing happened. The next morning looked ordinary enough. The kids went to school, the yard sat quiet, the mailman passed. But by the afternoon, the views began to climb. A few dozen clicks, then a few hundred. By evening, it was thousands. Neighbors shared it. Strangers commented. Former HOA residents from other states chimed in with horror stories of their own. And the footage? It was undeniable. The glowing timestamps, the clear shots of the HOA president scattering dirt and snapping photos. It was the kind of proof that left no room for excuses. The neighborhood that once whispered in fear now buzzed openly. Neighbors stopped by the Parker home to offer support. Some apologized for not speaking up sooner. A few even admitted they too had security footage of late-night inspections. The HOA board, however, reacted exactly as expected. Within days, another letter arrived, but this one was different. It accused the Parkers of defamation and malicious harassment of the board. It ordered the removal of the video and threatened legal action if it remained online. The Parkers laughed bitterly as they read it aloud. The footage wasn't harassment, it was truth. And truth, once released, had a way of spreading faster than any attempt to contain it, because the post hadn't just caught the attention of neighbors, it had caught the attention of local news. A week later, a reporter stood on the Parker lawn, microphone in hand, camera crew rolling. The segment aired that night. A family crushed by thousands in fines, a board accused of planting violations, and footage that spoke for itself. The HOA tried to issue statements. They claimed the video was taken out of context. They insisted the president was simply inspecting the property. But the excuses rang hollow. The tide had turned. Now, instead of being isolated, the Parkers found themselves at the center of a storm much larger than their lawn. Calls and messages poured in from across the country. Other families shared their own stories, their own footage, their own scars from years of HOA abuse. It wasn't just a neighborhood issue anymore. It was a movement. And yet, even with the world watching, the HOA refused to back down. They doubled the fines, pushing the total to nearly $15,000. They scheduled a hearing, summoning the Parkers to defend themselves in front of the very people who had sabotaged them. But this time, the Parkers weren't walking into that meeting empty-handed, because they had something more powerful than fines, threats, or liens. They had the truth, and they were about to unleash it in front of everyone. The night of the hearing felt like the calm before a storm. For weeks, the Parkers had prepared for this moment, printing photos, organizing video clips, and rehearsing every possible response to the accusations they knew would be thrown at them. But nothing could have prepared them for the way the community rallied. When the Parkers pulled up to the HOA clubhouse, they expected a handful of board members and maybe a few curious neighbors. Instead, the parking lot was full. Families stood clustered in small groups, arms folded, voices hushed, waiting for the show to begin. A few local reporters lingered, at the edges, cameras ready. The HOA board had underestimated how far this story had traveled. Inside, the atmosphere was tense. Folding chairs were arranged in neat rows, and at the front of the room sat the long table where the board members perched like judges. At the center, of course, was the president, the same woman captured in the Parkers' footage, clipboard in hand, lips pressed into a tight line. She looked calm. Too calm. "Mr. and Mrs. Parker," she began as they took their seats, "you are here today to address multiple violations of community landscaping regulations with an outstanding balance of $15,400. Unless this balance is paid in full, the association will proceed with a lien on your property." Her voice was crisp, practiced, as if she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. The room was silent except for the faint scratching of pens from a few board members. But then Mr. Parker leaned forward. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't shout. Instead, he slid a small USB drive across the table. "With all due respect," he said evenly, "before we talk about fines, I think the community deserves to see how those violations came to be." The board president frowned, but before she could object, Mr. Parker gestured toward the small projector the reporters had brought. Within seconds, the screen lit up, and there it was. The footage. Clip after clip played on the wall for everyone to see. The president crouching in the yard with a bag of weeds, her flashlight beam cutting through the night as she scattered dirt. The unmistakable sound of her phone camera clicking, capturing the very violations she had fined them for. Gasps rippled through the room. Neighbors shifted in their seats, whispering to one another. A few stood outright, pointing at the screen, shaking their heads in disbelief. The president's face tightened. She reached for her gavel, slamming it down. "This is out of order," she snapped. "These recordings are private property. They are inadmissible." But the crowd wasn't listening. One by one, neighbors began to speak. A retired man at the back raised his hand. "She fined me for a dead patch of grass last year. I watched her pour bleach on it with my own eyes." Another voice. "She wrote me up for a broken fence panel. I fixed it the same week, but she fined me anyway. Said it wasn't good enough." And another. "She trespassed in my garden. I thought I was losing my mind when weeds kept appearing. Now I see I wasn't." The board president tried to maintain control, but the room had slipped away from her. Every voice that rose only added fuel to the fire. The reporters scribbled furiously. Cameras flashed. The HOA's carefully crafted image of authority crumbled in real time. Still, the president refused to yield. "These accusations are baseless," she barked. "The Parkers are attempting to smear this board with fabricated evidence. We will not—" But Mrs. Parker cut her off, calm, steady, and deadly precise. "If the footage is fabricated, then why is it time-stamped to the exact minute before each of your violation letters was sent? Why does it show you, no one else, planting the very weeds you fined us for?" Silence. For the first time that evening, the board president had no script, no quick retort, no polished line. She sat frozen, her face pale, as the room buzzed with outrage. The Parkers didn't stop there. They pulled out the letters, every single fine stacked neatly in a binder. They laid them out, one by one, pairing them with the matching clip. Sabotage followed by citation. Sabotage followed by citation, over and over until the pile of evidence looked absurd in its completeness. By the end, there was no denying it. The Parkers weren't violators. They were victims. The board scrambled. Some members avoided eye contact, shifting uncomfortably in their chairs. Others whispered heatedly among themselves, clearly divided. For the first time, the cracks within the leadership showed. The crowd, however, had no doubts. Shouts erupted. "Resign! Shame on you! You've been robbing us for years!" The president slammed her gavel again, desperate for control, but it was useless. The room had turned against her, and then, in a moment no one saw coming, one of the board members, an older man with gray hair and tired eyes, stood up. "I can't be part of this anymore," he said. His voice shook, but his words carried weight. "They're telling the truth. I've seen her do it. We all have, but we stayed quiet. I won't stay quiet anymore." Gasps. Murmurs. A confession. The president's face crumbled. She tried to shout him down, but it was too late. The floodgates had opened. Neighbors surrounded the Parkers afterward, clapping their shoulders, thanking them, promising to stand by their side. The reporters cornered the board president, microphones thrust in her face, demanding answers. She pushed past them, red-faced, refusing to comment. The hearing ended not with a decision, but with chaos. The board fled the room. The community stayed, buzzing with energy, finally speaking freely after years of silence. For the first time since this nightmare began, the Parkers felt something they hadn't felt in months. Hope. They hadn't just defended themselves. They had cracked open the truth, but the war wasn't over, because the HOA president wasn't finished, and she was about to fight dirtier than ever before. The morning after the hearing, the Parker household should have felt lighter. For the first time in months, they had proof on their side, a community that finally believed them, and a board that had been publicly humiliated. But instead of relief, a cold tension hung in the air, because if there was one thing they had learned about their HOA president, about Karen, as many neighbors now called her behind her back, it was that she didn't lose gracefully, and she wasn't going down quietly. The retaliation began almost immediately. The very next day, a notice appeared taped to the Parkers' front door. "Final warning. Immediate lawn maintenance required. Failure to comply may result in foreclosure proceedings. It was laughable on its face. The lawn was trimmed, watered, and weed-free. Neighbors had even stopped by to compliment how immaculate it looked. But there it was, in bold black letters, as though the hearing had never happened. Then came the noise complaints. Anonymous reports filed to the HOA office claimed the Parker children were screaming at all hours of the night and disturbing community peace. Another claimed their dog barked nonstop, though the Parkers didn't even own a dog. Each complaint triggered a $250 fine. The letters piled up, one per day. By the end of the week, the total balance the HOA claimed the Parkers owed had ballooned, past $20,000. "She's trying to bury us," Mrs. Parker whispered late one night, staring at the stack of envelopes. Her hands shook as she flipped through them, each one a weapon dressed up in official stationery. Mr. Parker clenched his jaw. "She's scared. That's all this is. She knows she's losing control." But fear wasn't the only weapon Karen wielded. Rumors began to spread, whispered at the playground, murmured at the grocery store. Some said the Parkers were in financial ruin, desperate for attention. Others claimed they had doctored the footage, editing the clips to frame the president unfairly, and though many neighbors still stood by them, doubt began to creep into conversations. "What if it was edited?" someone asked at a block party. "She's crazy, sure, but faking videos? That's a serious claim." The HOA president had planted seeds of suspicion, and she watered them daily. The Parkers fought back as best they could. They doubled down on their social media campaign, posting new clips, sharing every letter, every false fine, exposing the absurdity to anyone willing to watch. And the internet was watching. Their story went viral on neighborhood forums, then on bigger platforms. Memes of HOA Karen circulated, complete with screenshots of her mid-scream at the hearing. Supporters from across the country sent messages of encouragement, but with the attention came threats. Late one night, Mr. Parker found their mailbox smashed, the metal twisted, letters scattered in the street. Spray painted across their driveway were 3 words in red: "Pay your dues." The kids were terrified. Mrs. Parker couldn't sleep. Every car that slowed near the house made them flinch, and yet, through the fear, there was a grim determination. "Let her play dirty," Mr. Parker said, filming the vandalism with his phone. "We'll show the world everything she does. She can't silence us anymore." But Karen wasn't working alone. Behind the scenes, she rallied her allies on the board. Though cracks had formed at the hearing, not everyone was ready to abandon her. Some had benefited from her reign: contracts with landscapers, backroom deals with towing companies, small perks that came from keeping her in power. Together, they launched their boldest move yet. The Parkers received an official summons. "HOA v. Parker family, motion for foreclosure." The board had filed a lawsuit in county court, claiming the family's unpaid fines justified seizing their home. It didn't matter that most of those fines were fabricated. It didn't matter that evidence of sabotage had already been presented. On paper, the balance was real, and the HOA intended to weaponize it. For the Parkers, it was the ultimate nightmare. Not just harassment, not just humiliation. Now, it was survival. The days leading up to the court date were a blur of panic and preparation. Neighbors came by with casseroles and sympathy, some offering to testify. Others avoided eye contact, fearful of drawing Karen's wrath. A few openly sided with the board, muttering that the Parkers should just pay up and move on. Reporters camped outside the clubhouse, sniffing for updates. Social media buzzed with hashtags, calling Save the Parkers and Connie Ho Karen. The family's lawyer, a sharp but overworked man named Castillo, warned them grimly, "HOAs win these cases more often than not. The law is written in their favor. But with your footage, with your evidence, you have a fighting chance." A fighting chance. That was all they needed. On the night before the trial, the Parker home was quiet. Too quiet. Mrs. Parker sat at the kitchen table, flipping through the binder of evidence, her eyes heavy with exhaustion. The kids were asleep upstairs, clinging to the idea that tomorrow would fix everything. Mr. Parker stood at the window, staring out into the dark street. For a moment, he swore he saw a figure standing under the street lamp, clipboard in hand, watching. But when he blinked, the figure was gone. He let the curtain fall back into place. "This ends tomorrow," he whispered. But deep down, he knew better. Tomorrow wasn't the end. It was just the next battle in a war that was tearing their community apart. The courthouse smelled faintly of disinfectant and old paper, sterile, cold, and unforgiving. Rows of wooden benches creaked under the weight of neighbors, reporters, and strangers who had followed the Parkers' saga online. At the front of the room, beneath the raised seal of the county court, sat the judge, a gray-haired man with sharp eyes who looked like he'd heard every excuse under the sun. This was it. The fight over weeds, fines, and harassment had snowballed into a trial that could decide whether the Parkers would keep their home or lose everything. The HOA side came armed like a small army. Karen sat at the center of the board's table, clipboard in hand as always, though today it was stacked with neatly tabbed binders. Her lawyer, a well-dressed professional with a voice as smooth as oil, projected confidence as he greeted the court. "Your Honor," he began, "this is a simple matter of unpaid dues and escalating fines. The HOA has rules. The Parkers broke them. They were given every opportunity to comply and they refused. This case is about fairness to the entire community, not just one family who thinks they're above the law." He spoke like a man who had given this speech 100 times before, because he had. HOAs across the state used the same playbook, and it usually worked. Karen smirked, her lips curling into a quiet smile as if victory was already hers. Then came the Parkers' turn. Their lawyer, Castillo, rose from his seat. His suit wasn't as sharp, his briefcase not as polished, but his voice carried something stronger than money: conviction. "Your Honor, what you're about to hear is not the story of a family refusing to follow rules. It's the story of a board abusing its power, targeting residents with harassment, falsified fines, and intimidation tactics. The Parkers aren't rebels against order. They are victims of a campaign designed to break them." He turned toward the gallery where neighbors sat. "And the evidence will prove it." The hearing stretched on for hours. The HOA's lawyer presented spreadsheets of fines, violation notices, and bylaws read aloud in dry, droning tones. He painted the Parkers as chronic rule breakers, who thought the community standards didn't apply to them. But then it was Castillo's turn. He rolled in a TV cart, plugged in a laptop, and played the hidden footage the Parkers had risked everything to capture. The courtroom filled with the sound of Karen's voice, sharp and venomous. "Let's make their lives so miserable they'll beg to sell. If they can't pay, we'll take the house." Gasps rippled through the gallery. Some neighbors leaned forward in disbelief. Others covered their mouths, ashamed they had once defended her. Castillo pressed on, showing the vandalism, the contradictory letters, the absurd fines for dogs that didn't exist, and noise complaints at times the family wasn't even home. "This isn't governance," Castillo thundered. "This is harassment. This is abuse. And if this court allows it to stand, no homeowner in this community, or any HOA across the state, will ever be safe from the same treatment." The judge sat stone-faced through it all, taking notes, asking questions only when necessary. But every so often, his brow furrowed when Karen's voice echoed through the courtroom again and again, dripping with malice. By the afternoon, the tension was unbearable. Neighbors whispered in the gallery. Reporters scribbled furiously. Karen's smirk had long since vanished, replaced by a rigid, clenched jaw. When it was finally her turn to testify, she took the stand with her usual confidence, but cracks began to show. "Those recordings are out of context," she snapped. "I was venting. Everyone vents. That doesn't mean we actually did those things." "Then how do you explain the vandalism?" Castillo pressed. Her eyes darted toward the board members behind her, but no one came to her defense. I don't control what residents do." "And the false noise complaints? The dog fines?" Karen stammered, voice rising higher, angrier. They were clerical errors. By the time she stepped down, the damage was done. Finally, after hours of testimony, cross-examination, and closing arguments, the judge leaned back in his chair. The room went silent. He shuffled papers, adjusted his glasses, and spoke in a measured tone that cut through the air like a knife. I've reviewed the evidence, I've considered the testimony, and what I see here is not a family defying community rules, but a board weaponizing those rules to pursue a personal vendetta. Karen's head snapped up, eyes wide. The fines issued against the Parker family are hereby vacated. The foreclosure action is dismissed with prejudice. Furthermore, this court orders the HOA to reimburse the Parkers' legal fees and imposes sanctions against the board for malicious conduct. Gasps erupted. A few neighbors clapped before being hushed. Parker sat frozen, barely processing what they had just heard. Then Mrs. Parker broke into tears, clutching her husband's hand so tightly her knuckles turned white. They had won, but victory didn't come without scars. Karen stormed out of the courtroom, her clipboard clutched like a weapon, muttering under her breath. Though stripped of much of her power, she remained a neighbor, a looming presence just across the street. The board fractured in the aftermath. Some resigned in disgrace, others stayed but under intense scrutiny. For the first time in years, homeowners whispered not in fear of retaliation, but with hope for change. The Parkers became unlikely heroes, their story spreading far beyond their neighborhood. Articles were written, podcasts covered the case. HOA reform advocates cited it as proof of a system desperately in need of oversight. And yet, at home, life slowly returned to normal. The lawn was just a lawn again, the porch a place for coffee and quiet mornings, the nights finally peaceful. Still, every so often, Mr. Parker would catch sight of a shadow in a window across the street, clipboard in hand, watching. The war was over. The verdict was in. But the memory of how close they had come to losing everything lingered like a scar, a reminder that sometimes the biggest battles aren't fought in fields or politics, but in the front yards of quiet suburbs where the real war is over control, power, and the simple right to call a place home.